The autumn rain had been falling steadily across the Devonshire countryside for 3 days, turning the roads between London and Ravenscroft Manor into treacherous ribbons of mud that challenged even the most skilled drivers. Duke Sebastian Ravenscroft sat rigid in his travelling coach, his green eyes fixed not on the landscape outside, but on the small, fever-bright face of the child who lay across from him, wrapped in blankets that could not seem to provide adequate warmth. The boy was perhaps 5 years old, with dark curls and features that would have been beautiful if not for the pallor of serious illness, and the way he flinched whenever adults spoke too loudly or moved too quickly. He had not spoken since Duke Sebastian had retrieved him from circumstances that still made the Duke's blood run cold with rage, and the physician who had examined him in London had warned that both his physical recovery and emotional healing would require care that went far beyond medicine. "Your Grace," Thomas Morrison, the Duke's aide-de-camp, said quietly from his position beside the driver, "the village of Millbrook is just ahead. Perhaps we should seek shelter until the storm passes." Duke Sebastian nodded curtly, his attention never leaving the child whose laboured breathing had been growing more concerning with each mile they travelled. The boy needed immediate medical attention and warm, dry lodging, but more than that, he needed the kind of gentle care that the Duke's own household, however well-intentioned, might not be equipped to provide. The year was 1834, and England stood at the crossroads between old traditions and new realities that challenged everything the nobility had once taken for granted. For Duke Sebastian, those challenges had become devastatingly personal in ways that threatened not just his carefully maintained reputation, but his understanding of duty, honor, and the terrible prices that both could exact from those least able to bear them. Millbrook proved to be a small farming village, whose modest cottages clustered around a stone church that had weathered centuries of wind and rain. The inn was humble but clean, its windows glowing with warmth that promised refuge from both the storm and the darker elements that had been pursuing them since their hasty departure from London. As their coach pulled into the inn-yard, Duke Sebastian found himself studying the face of a young woman who emerged from what appeared to be the village bakery, her arms laden with loaves that filled the air with the scent of fresh bread despite the driving rain. She moved with unconscious grace, her attention focused on protecting her cargo from the weather rather than on the elaborate coach that had brought such obvious wealth into their humble community. Miss Rose Hartwell, for he would learn her name within the hour, possessed the kind of natural beauty that no amount of elegant clothing could improve and no degree of humble circumstances could diminish. Her chestnut hair had escaped its pins to curl damply around her face, while her amber eyes held the warmth and intelligence that spoke to character rather than mere physical attractiveness. "Thomas," Duke Sebastian said suddenly, "ask that young woman if she would be willing to assist with emergency care for a sick child. Offer whatever compensation seems appropriate." Thomas looked surprised by the request. Duke Sebastian was not known for seeking assistance from village girls, but years of military service had taught him to follow orders without question, particularly when they came from someone whose judgment he had learned to trust implicitly. The conversation that followed was conducted in voices too low to be clearly overheard from inside the coach, but Duke Sebastian could see Rose's expression change from polite attention to genuine concern as Thomas explained their circumstances. When she approached the coach door with obvious purpose, he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with their immediate crisis. "Your Grace," she said with a curtsy that was perfectly executed despite her humble circumstances, "I understand you have a sick child requiring care. I have some experience with nursing, and I would be honored to assist in whatever way proves useful." Her voice carried the educated accents that suggested schooling beyond what most village girls received, while her manner reflected both natural dignity and genuine compassion for a child she had not yet met. "Miss," Duke Sebastian began. "Hartwell, Your Grace. Rose Hartwell. Miss Hartwell, the child has endured circumstances that have left him both physically weakened and emotionally traumatized. He requires gentle care from someone who understands that healing involves more than medicine." Rose's amber eyes moved to the small figure wrapped in blankets, and Duke Sebastian saw her expression soften with the kind of protective instinct that could not be feigned or taught. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the child with hands that were obviously accustomed to careful work. Duke Sebastian nodded, watching with growing relief as Rose settled beside the boy with movements that were slow enough to avoid startling him, while being purposeful enough to convey competence and safety. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, in a voice pitched to be soothing rather than demanding. "My name is Rose, and I'm here to help you feel better. You don't need to say anything if you don't want to. Just let me make sure you're warm enough." The child's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight relaxation in his rigid posture, a softening around his fever-bright eyes that suggested he recognized something trustworthy in Rose's presence. "He hasn't spoken since I found him," Duke Sebastian said quietly, his voice carrying pain that he rarely allowed others to detect. "Sometimes," Rose replied with gentle wisdom that seemed beyond her years, "children need time to find their voices again after they've been through frightening experiences. The important thing is letting them know they're safe now." As she adjusted the child's blankets with careful efficiency, Duke Sebastian found himself studying her profile with an intensity that would have been inappropriate under normal circumstances. There was something about her combination of competence and compassion that spoke to qualities he had not realized he was seeking until this moment. "Miss Hartwell," he said carefully, "would you be willing to accompany us to Ravencroft Manor? The boy requires extended care, and I believe he would benefit from your particular approach to nursing." Rose looked up at him with surprise that gradually gave way to something more complex: curiosity about the child's circumstances, concern about leaving her own responsibilities, and perhaps recognition that the Duke's request carried implications beyond simple employment. "Your Grace," she said hesitantly, "I would need to make arrangements for my current obligations. I teach at the village school, and the children depend upon consistent instruction." "Arrangements can be made," Duke Sebastian assured her, with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems through application of sufficient resources. "Miss Hartwell, I am prepared to compensate you generously for your time and to ensure that your absence from teaching creates no financial hardship for yourself or the school." The offer was clearly tempting, but Rose's hesitation suggested concerns that went beyond mere practical considerations. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "perhaps you could tell me more about the child's circumstances? Understanding what he has experienced would help me provide better care." Duke Sebastian felt his expression tighten with memories that still had the power to make him sick with rage and self-recrimination. The circumstances that had brought this child into his protection were complex, dangerous, and absolutely confidential, but they were also essential to understanding why proper care would require more than ordinary nursing skills. "Miss Hartwell," he said finally, "what I am about to tell you must remain absolutely confidential, regardless of whether you choose to accept my request for assistance." "I understand," Rose replied, though her tone suggested she was preparing for revelations that would be difficult to hear. "The child's name is Nicholas," Duke Sebastian began, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotion that threatened to break through. "He is the illegitimate son of my younger brother, Lord James Ravencroft, who died in a carriage accident 6 months ago." Rose's expression reflected sympathy for family loss, but Duke Sebastian could see that she was also beginning to understand that Nicholas's circumstances involved complications beyond simple bereavement. Nicholas was being raised by his mother, who was not someone James could marry, Duke Sebastian continued with obvious difficulty. When she died of consumption 3 weeks ago, responsibility for Nicholas fell to her cousin, who viewed him as an inconvenience to be disposed of rather than a child to be protected. "Disposed of how?" Rose asked with growing alarm. "Sold," Duke Sebastian said bluntly, the single word carrying all the horror of what he had discovered when he had finally tracked down his nephew's location. "To a workhouse that specialized in providing child labor for factory owners who were not particular about the treatment their workers received." Rose's face went white with shock at the casual brutality of such arrangements, but Duke Sebastian was not finished with revelations that would explain why Nicholas required care that went far beyond ordinary orphan assistance. "When I retrieved Nicholas from that place," he continued grimly, "he had been there for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit and make him compliant with whatever demands might be placed upon him. The implications were clear and sickening. Nicholas had been subjected to treatment that would have been horrific for an adult and was utterly devastating for a child barely old enough to understand what was happening to him. "He will recover," Duke Sebastian said with determination that brooked no argument, "but he will need care from someone who understands that trust must be rebuilt slowly and that safety must be demonstrated rather than simply promised." Rose was quiet for several moments, her amber eyes moving between the Duke's stern face and the child who had suffered so much in his short life. When she finally spoke, her voice carried conviction that impressed Duke Sebastian with its quiet strength. "Your Grace," she said clearly. "I will care for Nicholas for as long as he needs me, and I will ensure that he learns to feel safe and valued again." "Miss Hartwell," Duke Sebastian said with relief so profound it surprised him, "you may just have saved more than one life with that promise." As their coach resumed its journey toward Ravencroft Manor through the driving rain, none of its occupants could have predicted that what had begun as emergency assistance for a traumatized child would evolve into something that would challenge everything they thought they understood about duty, social boundaries, and the unexpected ways that love could grow from the simple act of caring for someone who needed protection. The Duke, who had requested help for his nephew, was about to discover that sometimes the most precious treasures were found in the most unlikely places, while the village girl who had agreed to help was about to learn that courage and compassion could open doors to worlds she had never dared imagine. Ravencroft Manor rose from the Devon Hills like something from a medieval legend, its ancient towers and battlements speaking to centuries of power and privilege that had shaped both the landscape and the lives of everyone who dwelt within its sphere of influence. As their coach wound up the tree-lined drive, Rose felt her breath catch at the sheer scale of the estate that would be her home for however long Nicholas required her care. The boy himself had slept fitfully during the final hours of their journey, occasionally murmuring words that made Duke Sebastian's jaw tighten with suppressed fury. Whatever Nicholas had endured during his brief captivity had left scars that would take far more than time to heal, requiring the kind of patient dedication that few people possessed the temperament to provide. "Miss Hartwell," Duke Sebastian said as they approached the manor's imposing entrance, "I should prepare you for the household's reaction to your arrival. My staff are accustomed to a certain formality in their interactions with guests." Rose understood the diplomatic warning. She would be neither guest nor servant, but something unprecedented that would challenge the established social order of one of England's great houses. Her position as Nicholas's caregiver would require access to family areas, while her humble birth would make such access socially controversial. "Your Grace," she replied with quiet dignity, "I am here to care for Nicholas, not to disrupt your household arrangements. Whatever accommodations you deem appropriate will be perfectly acceptable to me." Duke Sebastian found himself impressed by her composure in the face of circumstances that would intimidate most people of any social class. Rose Hartwell possessed a natural grace that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with character, a quality that would serve her well in navigating the complexities of her new position. The manor's entrance hall was magnificent. Soaring ceilings decorated with heraldic banners, portraits of stern ancestors, and architectural details that spoke to wealth accumulated over generations. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, stood waiting with the rigid posture that suggested both professional competence and considerable skepticism about whatever unusual arrangements the Duke had made. "Mrs. Whitmore," Duke Sebastian said with formal authority, "this is Miss Hartwell, who will be caring for Master Nicholas during his recovery. She is to have whatever she requires to ensure his comfort and healing, and her authority regarding his welfare is absolute." The housekeeper's expression revealed nothing, but Rose sensed undercurrents of surprise and reservation about the elevation of a village girl to such significant responsibility within the household hierarchy. "Of course, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore replied with professional courtesy. "Shall I prepare the blue room for Miss Hartwell's accommodation?" "The rose room," Duke Sebastian corrected, referring to the suite that connected to the nursery wing through a private door. "Miss Hartwell will need immediate access to Nicholas at all hours." The room assignment was significant. The Rose Room was typically reserved for family guests rather than employees, its elegant furnishings and prime location speaking to status that Rose's humble origins would not normally command. As they settled Nicholas into the nursery that had been hastily prepared for his arrival, Rose began to understand the full scope of the challenges that lay ahead. The room was beautifully appointed with every luxury that wealth could provide, but the child who would occupy it flinched away from the ornate furnishings, as if expecting them to transform into instruments of pain. "Nicholas," Rose said gently, kneeling to his eye level while maintaining enough distance to avoid making him feel trapped. "This is your room now. Everything here belongs to you, and no one will take it away or hurt you for touching it." The boy's dark eyes moved around the space with the wariness of someone who had learned that beautiful things could conceal terrible dangers. But Rose detected the faintest flicker of curiosity about the rocking horse and toy soldiers that had been arranged for his entertainment. "Perhaps," she continued in the same soothing tone, "we could explore your new treasures together. You can show me which ones you like best." Duke Sebastian watched this interaction from the doorway, marveling at Rose's instinctive understanding of how to approach a child whose trust had been systematically destroyed. Her patience and gentleness were already beginning to penetrate Nicholas's defensive barriers in ways that force or authority never could. Over the following days, Rose established routines that provided Nicholas with the predictability and safety he desperately needed. Meals were served at exactly the same times, bedtime stories followed identical patterns, and every activity was explained in advance so that the boy could prepare mentally for whatever was expected of him. "Miss Hartwell," Duke Sebastian observed one evening, as he watched Rose read to Nicholas from a collection of fairy tales, "your approach to his care is remarkable. He seems more at ease than I had dared hope possible." "Children are resilient when they feel truly safe," Rose replied, as Nicholas dozed against her shoulder with the complete relaxation that suggested genuine security. "Nicholas is beginning to understand that kindness here is not a prelude to cruelty." The progress was indeed remarkable, but it was also creating complications that neither Rose nor Duke Sebastian had anticipated. The intimacy required to care for a traumatized child had brought them into close daily contact, revealing character qualities in each other that challenged their assumptions about social boundaries and appropriate relationships. Rose had discovered that Duke Sebastian's stern exterior concealed profound compassion for those under his protection, while his attention to Nicholas's welfare revealed depths of caring that few people ever witnessed. His visits to the nursery were conducted with the kind of gentle patience that seemed inconsistent with his reputation for commanding authority in all other aspects of his life. Duke Sebastian, for his part, found himself increasingly drawn to Rose's combination of wisdom, warmth, and unshakable moral principles. Her devotion to Nicholas was clearly motivated by genuine affection rather than mere duty, while her natural intelligence and dignity challenged every assumption he had held about the supposed limitations of humble birth. "So, Your Grace," Rose said one afternoon as they walked together in the manor's gardens, while Nicholas played with a collection of wooden animals, "may I ask about Nicholas's future arrangements? Will he remain at Ravencroft permanently?" The question struck at the heart of Duke Sebastian's dilemma. Nicholas's presence in his household was both a joy and a potential scandal, the illegitimate child of his deceased brother, cared for by a village girl whose expanding influence was already generating speculation among the staff. "Nicholas will always have a home at Ravencroft," Duke Sebastian assured her, "but his long-term prospects depend upon considerations that extend beyond my personal wishes." "What considerations?" Rose asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected that social pressures were complicating Nicholas's situation. "The considerations," Duke Sebastian replied with obvious frustration, "of a society that judges children by the circumstances of their birth rather than their inherent worth. Nicholas's illegitimacy will always limit his opportunities unless..." "Unless what?" Duke Sebastian was quiet for several moments, weighing the wisdom of revealing thoughts that had been occupying his mind increasingly frequently as he watched Rose's devoted care for his nephew. "Unless he is adopted by someone with sufficient social standing to override questions about his parentage," he said finally. "Adoption would provide legal legitimacy that could give him access to education and opportunities that would otherwise be denied." Rose felt her heart sink at the implication that Nicholas might be sent away to live with adoptive parents, whose superior social position would come at the cost of the security and affection he had finally begun to accept. "Adoption by strangers?" she asked with obvious concern for Nicholas's emotional welfare. "Not necessarily strangers," Duke Sebastian replied carefully. "Adoption by someone he already trusts, someone whose care has already proven beneficial to his recovery." The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Rose stared at him in amazement as she began to understand that he might be proposing something that would transform not just Nicholas's future, but her entire existence. "Your Grace," she said with growing comprehension and alarm, "surely you cannot mean..." "I mean," Duke Sebastian said with quiet conviction that had clearly been building for weeks, "that Nicholas has found safety and happiness in your care that he has never known with anyone else. And I mean that you have proven yourself worthy of the kind of position that society might find acceptable if it were formalized through appropriate arrangements." Before Rose could respond to this extraordinary suggestion, Their conversation was interrupted by urgent sounds from the direction of the manor's main gate. Through the garden's entrance, they could see riders approaching with the purposeful haste that indicated either important news or significant trouble. Duke Sebastian's expression immediately hardened with the alertness that had served him well during his military career. "Thomas," he called to his aide, who appeared immediately from the manor's side entrance. "Your Grace," Thomas reported with grim efficiency, "Lord Ashford and his son Marcus are approaching with what appears to be an official escort. They carry documents that suggest legal business regarding Master Nicholas." Rose felt ice forming in her veins as she realized that Nicholas's peaceful recovery was about to be threatened by forces whose existence she had not previously suspected. Looking at Duke Sebastian's face, she could see that he had been expecting such a challenge, but had hoped it might be delayed until Nicholas was stronger. "What kind of legal business?" she asked with growing alarm. "The kind," Duke Sebastian replied grimly, "that challenges my authority to care for a child whose legal guardianship was never formally established." As the riders drew closer, and Nicholas unconsciously moved nearer to Rose's protective presence, all three realized that their fragile domestic tranquility was about to be tested by enemies whose resources and determination remained unknown, but whose intentions were clearly hostile to everything they had been building together. The village girl who had agreed to care for a traumatized child was about to discover that love and protection sometimes required fighting for the right to provide them. Lord Ashford's arrival at Ravencroft Manor was conducted with the kind of legal pomp that was designed to intimidate opposition before the actual confrontation began. His carriage bore heraldic arms that proclaimed his authority, while the documents he carried suggested official backing for whatever claim he intended to press regarding Nicholas's custody. Duke Sebastian received his uninvited guests in the manor's great hall, a setting that emphasized both his own authority and the historical weight of the Ravencroft family's position in English society. Rose stood beside him with Nicholas in her arms, the child having instinctively sought her protection when the threatening voices began echoing through the manor's corridors. "Your Grace," Lord Ashford announced with false courtesy that barely concealed his obvious satisfaction at having discovered grounds for legal challenge, "I regret the necessity of this visit, but urgent matters regarding the custody of the child require immediate resolution." "Lord Ashford," Duke Sebastian replied with icy formality, "Nicholas is under my protection as his uncle and nearest male relative. I am not aware of any legal challenges to arrangements that serve his welfare admirably." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken," Lord Ashford continued with the smooth confidence of someone who believed he held decisive advantages. "Legal guardianship requires proper documentation and court approval, neither of which appear to have been secured for your informal care arrangements." Marcus Ashford stepped forward with barely concealed eagerness to participate in what he clearly viewed as profitable disruption of Duke Sebastian's domestic arrangements. "Moreover," Marcus added with obvious malice, "we have received disturbing reports about the child's care being entrusted to persons whose qualifications and moral character are questionable for such important responsibilities." The attack on Rose's character was both expected and infuriating. Duke Sebastian felt rage building in his chest at hearing someone whose own moral flexibility was well known question the integrity of the most genuinely good person he had ever encountered. "Mr. Ashford," he said with dangerous calm, "you will explain immediately what qualifications you possess to evaluate either my judgment or Miss Hartwell's character." "We possess," Lord Ashford replied with satisfaction, "legal documentation establishing proper guardianship claims that supersede informal family arrangements." He withdrew an official-looking document from his coat and presented it with the theatrical flourish that suggested he viewed this confrontation as entertainment rather than serious legal business. "These papers," he announced, "establish my authority as Nicholas's legal guardian, appointed by probate court based on my relationship to the child's deceased mother and my superior qualifications for providing appropriate care." Duke Sebastian examined the documents with growing alarm as he realized that Lord Ashford's claim, however morally repugnant, appeared to have legitimate legal foundation. The guardianship had been established through Nicholas's maternal connections rather than paternal ones, bypassing Duke Sebastian's family entirely. "This is impossible," he said grimly. "Nicholas's mother had no family beyond a cousin who sold him to a workhouse." "Had no family?" Marcus corrected with obvious pleasure, until certain genealogical research revealed connections that had been overlooked in the initial arrangements following her death. Rose felt her blood run cold as she began to understand that Nicholas's brief period of safety had been discovered and targeted by people whose interest in his welfare was clearly secondary to other considerations. "What genealogical research?" Duke Sebastian demanded. "Research establishing that the child's mother was my late wife's second cousin," Lord Ashford explained, with the satisfaction of someone revealing a carefully prepared trap. "Relationship close enough to establish guardianship rights, distant enough that previous oversight was understandable. Convenient timing for such discoveries," Duke Sebastian observed, with barely controlled fury. "Indeed," Lord Ashford agreed without embarrassment, "though I prefer to view it as providence ensuring that the child receives proper care rather than continued exposure to irregular domestic arrangements." The reference to irregular arrangements was clearly directed at Rose's position in the household, suggesting that Lord Ashford intended to use social scandal as well as legal pressure to achieve his objectives. "Miss Hartwell's care has been exemplary," Duke Sebastian stated with finality that brooked no argument. "I'm certain it has been thorough," Marcus said with insinuation that made Duke Sebastian's hands clench into fists. "But surely you understand that proper upbringing requires more than mere personal attention from persons whose backgrounds are unsuitable for molding young minds." Before Duke Sebastian could respond to this calculated insult, Rose herself stepped forward with dignity that impressed everyone present, despite the obvious difference in their social positions. "Gentlemen," she said with quiet authority that commanded attention despite her humble circumstances, "perhaps you would care to explain your specific plans for Nicholas's care and education. I am certain His Grace would appreciate understanding exactly what superior arrangements you propose to provide." The direct challenge clearly caught both Ashfords off guard. They had expected resistance from Duke Sebastian, but not intelligent questioning from someone they viewed as insignificant. "The child will receive," Lord Ashford said with obvious improvisation, "proper education befitting his station and moral guidance appropriate to his circumstances." "What station would that be?" Rose continued relentlessly. "And what moral guidance specifically? Nicholas has particular needs based on trauma he has experienced. How do you propose to address those requirements?" "The child's previous difficulties," Marcus interjected with callous dismissal, "will be resolved through firm discipline and structured routine that removes him from corrupting influences." Rose felt Nicholas tense in her arms at the mention of firm discipline, his small body remembering institutional horrors that such phrases had preceded. Duke Sebastian noticed the child's reaction immediately, his protective instincts flaring at the evidence that Nicholas understood exactly what kind of care the Ashfords represented. "Lord Ashford," he said with deadly calm, "Nicholas is not leaving Ravencroft Manor. Legal documents or no legal documents, I will not permit him to be placed in care that traumatizes him further." "Your Grace," Lord Ashford replied with false regret, "I'm afraid the matter is no longer subject to your personal preferences. Legal guardianship has been established through proper channels, and resistance to its implementation would constitute interference with lawful authority. Then we shall contest your guardianship through those same proper channels," Duke Sebastian replied, with determination that surprised the Ashfords with its intensity. "Contest on what grounds?" Marcus asked with obvious confidence that no such grounds existed. "On the grounds," Rose said suddenly, her voice carrying conviction that had been building throughout the confrontation, "that alternative arrangements exist which serve Nicholas's interests superior to your guardianship." All eyes turned to her with varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and growing alarm as she stepped forward with an announcement that would change everything. "What alternative arrangements?" Lord Ashford demanded. "Marriage," Rose said clearly, "between His Grace and myself, which would provide Nicholas with a legal family structure that supersedes external guardianship claims." The declaration struck the Great Hall like lightning. Duke Sebastian stared at Rose with amazement at her courage in proposing something that would solve Nicholas's legal problems while creating enormous social complications for them both. "Marriage," Marcus repeated with obvious disbelief, "between a duke and a village schoolmistress." "Marriage," Duke Sebastian said with growing conviction, as he realized that Rose had provided the perfect solution to their seemingly impossible situation, "between myself and the woman whose character and capabilities have proven themselves worthy of the highest respect." "This is preposterous," Lord Ashford protested, Such an arrangement would be socially scandalous and legally questionable. Actually, Duke Sebastian replied with grim satisfaction as he began to understand the full implications of Rose's brilliant strategy. Such an arrangement would be entirely legal and would indeed supersede your guardianship claims by providing Nicholas with legitimate family placement. As the Ashfords realized that their carefully prepared legal assault had been countered by a move they had never anticipated, Rose looked into Duke Sebastian's green eyes and saw not just gratitude for her quick thinking, but something deeper that suggested her impulsive proposal might serve more than merely tactical purposes. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "are you prepared to accept the social consequences of marriage to someone of my station?" "Miss Hartwell," he replied with growing warmth, "are you prepared to accept the consequences of marriage to someone who has just discovered that he cannot imagine a future that doesn't include both you and Nicholas in it?" As their unexpected engagement transformed a legal crisis into the foundation for a future none of them had dared imagine, Nicholas remained secure in Rose's arms, living proof that sometimes the most important battles were won not through force, but through the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. The emergency wedding of Duke Sebastian and Miss Rose took place 3 days later in Ravencroft Manor's private chapel, conducted with necessary speed, but surprising dignity considering the circumstances that had prompted such immediate action. Bishop Whitmore, summoned from the cathedral town of Exeter, performed the ceremony with the discretion that 40 years of serving aristocratic families had taught him was often more valuable than elaborate ritual. Rose wore a gown of cream silk that had been altered overnight from one of the late Duchess's wedding dresses, the seamstresses working with remarkable skill to transform the elegant garment into something that fitted her smaller figure while maintaining its inherent grandeur. Duke Sebastian appeared in full ceremonial dress, his presence commanding enough to lend gravity to even this hastily arranged union. Nicholas served as ring-bearer, his small hands steady as he carried the ancient Ravencroft wedding ring that had been resized to fit Rose's slender finger. At 5 years old, he did not fully understand the legal complexities that had prompted this ceremony, but he clearly grasped that it represented security for the fragile family unit that had become his world. "Do you, Sebastian Edward Ravencroft, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Duke Sebastian replied, his green eyes never leaving Rose's face as he made vows that carried weight far beyond their immediate tactical necessity. "Do you, Rose Catherine Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and cherish through whatever challenges may come, until death do you part?" "I do," Rose said clearly, her voice carrying across the chapel to every witness present, as she committed herself not just to Duke Sebastian, but to the life they would build together as guardians of the child who had brought them to this moment. The kiss that sealed their marriage was brief but electric, carrying promises that neither had yet had time to fully understand, but both hoped would prove worthy of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Lord Pemberton, Duke Sebastian's solicitor, served as witness alongside Dr. Morrison, whose presence ensured that medical testimony would be available to support whatever explanations became necessary regarding the timing and motivations for such a rapid wedding. The wedding breakfast was held in the manor's smaller dining room, attended by household staff whose loyalty to Duke Sebastian had overcome their initial skepticism about his choice of bride. Mrs. Whitmore, in particular, had been won over by Rose's gracious manner and obvious devotion to Nicholas's welfare. "Your Graces," she said with tears in her eyes as she offered the traditional toast to the newlywed couple, "may your marriage bring happiness to this house and continued healing to Master Nicholas." The reference to healing was particularly significant. In the 3 days since Lord Ashford's legal challenge, Nicholas had shown remarkable improvement in both confidence and communication. The security provided by knowing that Rose would not be taken away from him had unlocked emotional barriers that weeks of patient care had only begun to address. "Rose," he said clearly during the wedding breakfast, addressing her directly for the first time since his rescue, "are you my mama now?" The question brought tears to Rose's eyes as she realized that Nicholas was finally ready to accept the family relationships that would provide him with permanent security. "If you would like me to be," she replied gently, "then yes, I am your mama now, and nothing will ever separate us again. And Uncle Sebastian is my papa?" Duke Sebastian felt his throat tighten with emotion at hearing Nicholas claim him as a father figure rather than merely a protective uncle. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice rough with feelings he had not expected to experience. "I am your papa, and this is our family forever." The weeks following their wedding brought adjustments that tested both Rose's adaptability and Duke Sebastian's willingness to challenge social conventions for the sake of their unusual domestic arrangement. Rose's transformation from village schoolmistress to duchess required mastering complex protocols while maintaining the natural warmth that had made her effective with Nicholas. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore explained during one of their regular consultations about household management, "the dinner party next week will include several members of the local gentry who are curious about your background and the circumstances of your marriage to His Grace." The diplomatic warning was clear. Rose would be facing social scrutiny from people whose acceptance would determine whether her elevation to duchess status could be sustained in county society. "What would you advise regarding their curiosity?" Rose asked with the practical intelligence that had impressed everyone who worked with her. "Complete confidence in your right to be here," Mrs. Whitmore replied firmly. "Your conduct since arriving at Ravencroft has been exemplary. Your care for Master Nicholas has been transformative, and your marriage to His Grace serves the interests of this family admirably." The support from household staff proved crucial as Rose navigated the challenges of her new position, but it was Duke Sebastian's unwavering commitment to their partnership that provided the foundation for her growing confidence in aristocratic society. "Rose," he said one evening as they reviewed correspondence that had arrived from various social connections throughout Devon, "I want you to understand that our marriage may have begun as a practical necessity, but it has become something far more meaningful to me." "What has it become?" Rose asked, though her tone suggested she hoped for answers that would confirm feelings that had been developing despite the unusual circumstances of their union. "It has become the foundation for happiness I had not dared hope to find," Duke Sebastian replied with growing warmth. "Rose, what I feel for you extends far beyond gratitude for your care of Nicholas or admiration for your courage in accepting marriage to solve our legal crisis." "And what do you feel for me?" she asked quietly. "Love," he said simply. "Complete, overwhelming love for the most remarkable woman I have ever encountered." Before Rose could respond to this declaration, their intimate conversation was interrupted by urgent knocking at the drawing room door, followed by Thomas Morrison's announcement that Lord Ashford had returned to Ravencroft with additional legal documentation and what appeared to be official support for renewed challenges to their domestic arrangements. "What kind of additional documentation?" Duke Sebastian asked with growing tension. "Documents questioning the validity of your marriage on grounds that proper bans were not published, and that the ceremony was conducted under suspicious circumstances that suggest fraud or coercion," Thomas reported with obvious concern for the implications. Rose felt ice forming in her veins as she realized that their legal victory had been temporary rather than permanent. Lord Ashford was clearly determined to pursue his guardianship claims through whatever means proved necessary, including attacks on the marriage that had been designed to protect Nicholas. "He's challenging our marriage itself," she said with growing alarm. "Then we'll defend it," Duke Sebastian replied with determination that brooked no argument. "Rose, our marriage is legally valid and personally meaningful. No amount of external pressure will change either fact. But if the courts rule that our wedding was fraudulent, they won't," Duke Sebastian assured her with confidence born of careful preparation. "Because Bishop Whitmore conducted the ceremony with full authority, proper witnesses were present, and our union has been consummated in ways that make annulment legally impossible." The reference to consummation brought color to Rose's cheeks, but it also reminded both of them that their marriage had indeed evolved beyond mere practical arrangement into genuine partnership that served both legal and emotional needs. As they prepared to face Lord Ashford's renewed assault on their fragile family structure, Nicholas appeared in the drawing-room doorway with the confident bearing that had gradually replaced his previous fearfulness. "Papa, Mama," he said with the clear diction that had been developing under Rose's patient encouragement, "are the bad men trying to take me away again?" "No, sweetheart," Rose assured him with fierce conviction. "The bad men will never take you away from us. We are a family now, and families protect each other no matter what." "Always?" Nicholas asked. "Always," Duke Sebastian confirmed, gathering his wife and son into an embrace that symbolized everything they had fought to create and everything they were prepared to defend. As Lord Ashford's carriage approached the manor for what would prove to be the final confrontation over Nicholas's future, all three members of their unusual family understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost, and some bonds were strong enough to survive whatever challenges society might devise to test them. The village girl who had agreed to care for a traumatized child had become a duchess whose love would prove stronger than any legal maneuvering, while the duke who had sought help for his nephew had discovered that true happiness came from building a family based on choice rather than obligation. The final confrontation with Lord Ashford took place in Ravencroft Manor's library, surrounded by volumes that had witnessed generations of family crises, but none quite as crucial as the legal battle that would determine Nicholas's permanent future. Duke Sebastian positioned himself behind the massive oak desk that had been his father's command center, while Rose stood beside him with Nicholas safely positioned between them, a visual representation of the family unit they were prepared to defend against all challenges. Lord Ashford entered with the confidence of someone who believed he held decisive legal weapons, accompanied by Marcus and a stern-faced gentleman whose formal attire and official bearing marked him as a representative of ecclesiastical or governmental authority. "Your Grace, Your Grace," Lord Ashford said with deliberate hesitation over Rose's title that was clearly designed to suggest doubt about its legitimacy, "may I present Magistrate Sir Henry Pembroke, who has been investigating certain irregularities regarding your recent union." Sir Henry stepped forward with the gravitas befitting someone whose decisions could reshape the lives of everyone present. "Your Grace," he said to Duke Sebastian with professional courtesy, "I have been asked to examine documentation regarding your marriage to determine whether proper legal procedures were followed and whether the union constitutes a valid impediment to Lord Ashford's guardianship claims." "Sir Henry," Duke Sebastian replied with controlled authority, "I am prepared to provide whatever documentation you require to confirm that our marriage was conducted with full legal authority and proper religious blessing." "Excellent," Sir Henry said, settling into the chair that had been provided for his use. "Let us begin with the circumstances surrounding the decision to marry. When did you first propose marriage to the current Duchess?" The question was designed to reveal whether their marriage had been prompted by romantic attachment or by practical necessity, a distinction that could affect its legal validity if coercion or fraud were suspected. "Sir Henry," Rose said before Duke Sebastian could respond, "perhaps I might clarify the circumstances that led to our marriage, as the party whose consent is most relevant to questions of coercion or undue influence." Sir Henry looked surprised at being addressed directly by someone whose legal standing he was investigating, but he nodded for her to continue. "His Grace and I developed mutual affection over the weeks that I cared for Nicholas," Rose said with quiet dignity. "When Lord Ashford's guardianship claims threatened to separate Nicholas from the security he had found at Ravencroft, we realized that marriage would serve both our personal feelings and Nicholas's welfare." "And your personal feelings preceded the legal crisis?" Sir Henry asked pointedly. "They did," Rose confirmed without hesitation, "though we might not have acted upon them as quickly without external pressures that made delay inadvisable." Before Sir Henry could pursue this line of questioning further, Duke Sebastian withdrew a leather portfolio from his desk drawer and placed it before the magistrate with obvious satisfaction. "Sir Henry," he said, "perhaps these documents will clarify any questions about our motivations and the validity of our union." The portfolio contained correspondence that had been carefully preserved for exactly this purpose, letters between Duke Sebastian and Rose that demonstrated growing affection and mutual respect developing over weeks rather than sudden decisions prompted by crisis. "Love letters," Marcus observed with obvious skepticism as Sir Henry began reading the carefully penned pages. "Correspondence between two people discovering that practical partnership was evolving into genuine affection," Duke Sebastian corrected firmly. "Documentation that our marriage was based on real feelings rather than mere convenience." Sir Henry read the letters with growing interest, his expression suggesting that their contents were providing evidence that supported the Ravencroft's position rather than Lord Ashford's challenges. "These letters," he observed, "appear to demonstrate sincere attachment developing over an extended period, rather than sudden decisions prompted by legal emergencies." "Exactly," Rose confirmed. "Our marriage formalized feelings that had been growing naturally, rather than creating artificial relationships for tactical purposes. But Lord Ashford was not prepared to concede defeat so easily." "Sir Henry," he interjected, Surely you must consider the irregularities in the marriage ceremony itself. No proper bans were published, no extended engagement was announced. The entire affair has the appearance of hasty concealment rather than proper matrimonial procedure. Actually, came a new voice from the library's entrance, the marriage ceremony was conducted with full ecclesiastical authority and proper legal foundation. Bishop Whitmore entered with the dignity that befitted his position, carrying documentation that would settle questions about the wedding's legitimacy permanently. Bishop Whitmore, Sir Henry said with the respect due to ecclesiastical authority, I understand you conducted the marriage ceremony in question. I did indeed, Bishop Whitmore confirmed with satisfaction, under special license granted by my authority as bishop, with proper witnesses present, and with full knowledge of the circumstances that prompted the timing, and your assessment of those circumstances, that Duke Sebastian and Miss Hartwell, now Her Grace, were genuinely devoted to each other and to the welfare of young Nicholas, Bishop Whitmore replied with conviction. I have rarely seen a marriage that more clearly served the interests of all parties involved. But surely the speed of the ceremony suggests irregularities, Marcus began. The speed of the ceremony, Bishop Whitmore interrupted with gentle authority, suggests urgency prompted by love and protective instincts rather than any fraudulent intentions. I was fully satisfied regarding the validity and appropriateness of the union. Sir Henry closed the correspondence he had been reviewing and fixed Lord Ashford with a steady gaze that suggested his conclusions were not favourable to continued challenges. Lord Ashford, he said with official finality, based on the evidence presented, I find no grounds to question the validity of the Duke's marriage or its effectiveness as an impediment to your guardianship claims. This is impossible, Lord Ashford protested with obvious frustration. The child belongs with his maternal relations. The child belongs, Sir Henry corrected firmly, with the family that has proven most capable of providing for his welfare. Marriage has created a legitimate family structure that serves Nicholas's interests far better than any external guardianship arrangement. Moreover, Duke Sebastian added with grim satisfaction, any further attempts to disrupt Nicholas's placement will be met with legal action for harassment and interference with family integrity. The threat was clear and comprehensive. Continued challenges would expose Lord Ashford to exactly the kind of legal scrutiny that his previous questionable activities could not withstand. As father and son prepared to depart in defeat, Nicholas himself stepped forward with the confidence that had been growing under the security of his parents' protection. Sir, he said to Sir Henry with perfect childish courtesy, thank you for making sure I can stay with my mama and papa. They take very good care of me and I love them very much. The innocent declaration from the child at the center of the controversy provided the final confirmation that all legal decisions had served their intended purpose of protecting those who needed protection most. Young man, Sir Henry replied with obvious warmth, it is clear that you are exactly where you belong. After their visitors departed, the three members of the Ravencroft family found themselves alone in the library that had witnessed their legal triumph, but more importantly, had confirmed the bonds that had grown between them. Is it truly over? Rose asked with lingering anxiety about future challenges. Completely over, Duke Sebastian assured her with conviction. Nicholas is legally our son. Our marriage is unassailable, and anyone who threatens our family's peace will face consequences they cannot afford to risk. Forever? Nicholas asked with 5-year-old need for absolute certainty. Forever, both parents replied simultaneously, their voices carrying the promise that had become the foundation of everything they had built together. As they stood together in the library, surrounded by books that recorded centuries of family history, all three understood that they had become part of that history themselves, proof that love could indeed triumph over legal maneuvering, that courage could overcome social prejudice, and that families formed by choice could be as strong as those created by blood. The Duke, who had asked a village girl to care for his nephew, had discovered that sometimes the most precious gifts came disguised as simple requests for help, while the girl who had agreed to provide care had found that kindness could indeed transform lives in ways that no one could predict or control. Nicholas would grow up secure in the knowledge that he had been fought for, protected and chosen by parents whose love had proven stronger than any obstacle society could devise to challenge it. The months following their legal victory brought a transformation to Ravencroft Manor that extended far beyond the resolution of custody disputes or the formalization of family relationships. Duke Sebastian and Rose settled into married life with a natural harmony that surprised both the household staff and county society, while Nicholas flourished under the security of parents whose love had been tested by crisis and proven unshakable. Rose's evolution from village schoolmistress to duchess proved remarkably successful, her natural intelligence and warm character winning acceptance from local society that had initially been skeptical about such an unconventional elevation. Her work establishing schools for estate children and supporting charitable foundations throughout Devon demonstrated that her concern for others extended far beyond her own dramatic change in circumstances. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitmore reported one morning as Rose reviewed plans for the upcoming harvest festival, "the tenants have asked me to express their gratitude for the improvements you've brought to the estate. The children's literacy has improved dramatically under your educational programs." "Mrs. Whitmore," Rose replied with the modest grace that had characterized her approach to her new position, "any improvements reflect the hard work of parents who recognize the value of education for their children. I merely provided some organizational assistance." Duke Sebastian, observing this exchange from the doorway of Rose's private sitting room, felt the profound satisfaction that came from watching someone he loved excel in roles that utilized all their capabilities. Marriage to Rose had brought him not just personal happiness, but partnership in estate management that had elevated Ravencroft's operations to new levels of efficiency and tenant welfare. Nicholas himself had become the living embodiment of their family's success, his confidence and intelligence developing under the careful nurturing of parents who understood that his early trauma required patience rather than pressure. At 6 years old, he displayed the curiosity and warmth that suggested complete emotional recovery from his devastating early experiences. "Mama, Papa," he announced one afternoon as he burst into the library where his parents were reviewing correspondence. "Mr. Thompson says I read better than children twice my age. Can I help teach the younger ones at the school?" The request demonstrated both intellectual advancement and the compassionate nature that had been carefully cultivated through years of experiencing genuine kindness rather than institutional cruelty. "If Mr. Thompson believes you're ready for such responsibility," Rose replied with maternal pride, "then I think helping younger children would be a wonderful experience for you, but only if you continue your own studies with the same dedication," Duke Sebastian added, with paternal authority tempered by obvious affection. "I promise, Papa," Nicholas assured him, with the earnestness that characterized his approach to all commitments. "I want to learn everything so I can help even more people when I grow up." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier bearing news that would provide the final confirmation of how completely their family's transformation had been accepted at the highest levels of society. The letter bore royal seals that indicated correspondence from Queen Victoria herself. Duke Sebastian opened the official communication with the respect due to royal correspondence, but his expression quickly shifted from formal attention to genuine pleasure as he read the contents. "Remarkable news," he announced to his family. "Her Majesty has appointed me to the Board of Guardians for Charitable Institutions, with specific responsibility for developing standards of care for orphaned children throughout England." The appointment was both personally meaningful and professionally significant, recognition of Duke Sebastian's successful guardianship of Nicholas, while providing him with authority to ensure that other vulnerable children received protection rather than exploitation. "That's wonderful," Rose said with genuine excitement about the opportunity to extend their protective influence beyond their immediate family. "Will the position require extensive travel to London?" "Some travel will be necessary," Duke Sebastian confirmed, "but the Queen has specifically requested that you accompany me as advisor on educational and emotional care standards. Apparently, reports of your work with Nicholas and the estate children have reached court attention." Rose felt amazement at the prospect of royal recognition for work that had grown from simple compassion rather than ambition for official acknowledgement. The request suggested that their family's unconventional beginning had evolved into something that served as an example rather than a scandal. "Both of us?" Nicholas asked, with obvious hope that family travel might include exciting adventures. "All of us," Duke Sebastian confirmed with paternal indulgence. "The position includes family residence in London during parliamentary sessions, which means you'll have access to tutors and educational opportunities that will complement your work here at Ravencroft." As they discussed the implications of this royal appointment, all three family members understood that their influence would now extend far beyond their own estate to affect policies that could protect vulnerable children throughout the realm. 2 years later, as Duchess Rose held their infant daughter Catherine while watching Nicholas teach reading to a group of younger children in the estate's expanded schoolhouse, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from village obscurity to national influence in child welfare policy. The work she and Duke Sebastian had undertaken through the Board of Guardians had resulted in legislation that regulated institutional care, established standards for guardianship appointments, and created legal protections that would prevent other children from experiencing the horrors that Nicholas had survived. "Your Grace," came a familiar voice from the schoolhouse doorway. Dr. Morrison, now in his 70s but still serving as the family's medical advisor, approached with the satisfied expression that usually indicated positive developments. "Dr. Morrison," Rose replied warmly, adjusting baby Catherine in her arms while keeping watch on Nicholas's patient instruction of his young pupils. "How can I help you today?" "Actually, Your Grace, I bring news that I believe will provide considerable satisfaction," the elderly physician said with obvious pleasure. "Lord Ashford has been arrested on charges of fraud and child endangerment related to his management of several charitable institutions." The news was both gratifying and vindictive, proof that their success in protecting Nicholas had been part of a larger pattern of investigating and prosecuting those who exploited vulnerable children for personal profit. "What will happen to him?" Rose asked, though her tone suggested that justice rather than revenge motivated her interest. "Transportation to Australia if convicted," Dr. Morrison replied with professional satisfaction. "The evidence against him is overwhelming, and his son Marcus has already fled to the continent to avoid similar charges." As Duke Sebastian joined them after completing his own consultation with the estate's manager, Rose shared the news that their former enemies would no longer pose threats to any children's welfare. "Justice at last," he said with grim satisfaction. "Though it comes later than it should have for the children who suffered before Nicholas's case brought attention to these abuses. But it comes in time to protect future children," Rose pointed out with the forward-looking perspective that had characterized her approach to their expanded responsibilities. "Our work has created systems that will outlast any individual cases." As evening approached and the schoolhouse emptied of students returning to their families, the Ravencrofts walked together toward the manor that had become not just their home, but the center of work that had transformed their personal happiness into service that benefited countless others. Nicholas ran ahead with 7-year-old energy, while Catherine dozed peacefully in Rose's arms, both children secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally and destined for lives of purpose and meaning. "Any regrets?" Duke Sebastian asked, as they paused to watch the sunset paint the Devon hills in shades of gold and rose. "Only that we didn't meet sooner," Rose replied honestly. "So we could have had more years together and helped more children along the way." "Then perhaps," Sebastian said, taking her free hand with the same reverence he had shown since their first desperate conversation about Nicholas's care, "we should focus on making the years ahead count for as much as possible." Their kiss was witnessed by Nicholas, who had circled back to ensure his parents were following at an appropriate pace, and by baby Catherine, whose contented sigh suggested that even infants could recognize the security that came from being surrounded by love that had proven strong enough to overcome any challenge. The Duke, who had asked a village girl to care for his nephew, had discovered that sometimes the most important requests were the ones that seemed simple on the surface, but required extraordinary courage to fulfill completely. The girl who had agreed to help had learned that kindness offered without expectation of reward could lead to happiness beyond imagination and influence that extended far beyond personal circumstances. Nicholas would grow up knowing that his parents had fought for him when he could not fight for himself, while Catherine would grow up experiencing from birth the security that her brother had found only through rescue and recovery. Together, they had built something beautiful from crisis, something lasting from emergency intervention, and something meaningful from the simple recognition that every child deserved protection, love, and the opportunity to grow into their full potential, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them into the world. 15 years after that rain-soaked day when Duke Sebastian had first asked a village girl to care for his traumatized nephew, Duchess Rose stood on the terrace of their London residence, watching the Thames flow past while reviewing correspondence that had arrived from Ravencroft Manor. The autumn afternoon was crisp with promise, and the scene below spoke to a life that had expanded far beyond the boundaries of a single estate to encompass national influence in child welfare policy. Nicholas, now 20 years old and reading law at Oxford University, had written to share news of his acceptance into the prestigious Middle Temple, where he would begin training for a career devoted to protecting children's legal rights. His letter carried the confidence and moral clarity that had developed under years of security and educational opportunity that his early circumstances could never have provided. "Dearest Mama and Papa," he wrote in the careful script that had been perfected through years of excellent tutoring, "I wanted you to know that Professor Blackwell has invited me to assist with research into reforming guardianship laws. He says my unique perspective on the subject could contribute valuable insights to legislative proposals currently under parliamentary consideration." Rose felt tears of pride in her eyes as she read evidence of how completely Nicholas had transformed personal trauma into professional purpose. The frightened child who had once flinched from loud voices was becoming a young man whose voice would advocate for others who faced similar vulnerabilities. Catherine, now 14, and possessed of her father's analytical mind combined with her mother's compassionate nature, appeared on the terrace with news that would add another dimension to their family's ongoing dedication to child welfare. "Mama," she announced with the directness that had become her trademark, "Papa says the Queen has summoned you both for consultation about establishing a royal commission on child protection. Is that as important as it sounds?" "More important," Rose replied with gratitude for royal recognition that would provide their work with official authority and enhanced resources. "If Her Majesty creates such a commission, we'll have the power to investigate abuses and implement reforms throughout the entire realm." The prospect of expanded influence was both exciting and daunting, representing the culmination of 15 years of careful work-building programs and establishing precedents that had gradually transformed how English society addressed the welfare of its most vulnerable children. Duke Sebastian emerged from his study with the correspondence that had prompted the royal summons. Reports from magistrates throughout England documenting the success of programs modelled on their Devon innovations, along with requests for guidance in addressing cases that required expertise beyond local capabilities. "The Yorkshire reports are particularly encouraging," he said with satisfaction as he joined his wife and daughter on the terrace. "Institutional reforms based on our recommendations have reduced child mortality in workhouses by more than 60%, while improving educational outcomes dramatically." "And the Manchester statistics?" Rose asked, referring to industrial areas where child labour abuses had proven most resistant to reform efforts. "Even better than anticipated," Sebastian replied with obvious pleasure. "Factory inspections following our protocols have identified and prosecuted dozens of employers who were violating child protection laws. More importantly, alternative educational programs are providing children with skills that make them valuable workers rather than expendable labour." As they discussed the practical implications of their expanded commission, Thomas Morrison appeared with announcement of visitors whose identity would provide perfect symmetry to their afternoon's focus on family achievements. "Your Graces," he said with the respectful formality that had characterized his service to the Ravenscroft family for decades, "Lord and Lady Pemberton have arrived with their ward, young Master Timothy, whom they believe might benefit from consultation regarding his educational needs." Rose and Sebastian exchanged glances that carried 15 years of shared understanding about their role in providing guidance to families facing challenges with traumatized or academically advanced children. "Please show them to the drawing room," Rose replied with the gracious authority that had evolved from her village roots into something approaching natural nobility. "We'll join them immediately." The consultation that followed demonstrated how completely their expertise had become recognized throughout English society. Lord Pemberton's ward was a brilliant 8-year-old whose academic gifts were being overshadowed by behavioral difficulties that stemmed from early neglect before his adoption. "Master Timothy," Rose said gently as she knelt to the boy's eye level with the same instinctive understanding she had shown to Nicholas years earlier, "I understand you're very good at mathematics and reading, but sometimes school feels overwhelming." The child nodded with the wariness that characterized intelligent children who had learned to expect disappointment from adults who claimed to want to help. "Sometimes," Rose continued with patient warmth, "very smart children need different kinds of teaching that let them learn as quickly as their minds want to go. Would you like to hear about schools where children like you feel comfortable and excited about learning? As she explained educational alternatives that would challenge Timothy's intellectual gifts while providing the emotional security he needed to thrive, Duke Sebastian watched with admiration that had only deepened over their years of marriage. The village girl who had agreed to care for a single traumatized child had become someone whose influence protected thousands of children while serving as an example of how individual compassion could create systematic change. After the Pembertons departed with detailed recommendations for Timothy's educational placement and ongoing support, the Ravenscroft family gathered in their private sitting room to review the day's developments and plan for the Royal Commission work that would define their immediate future. "Mama," Catherine said with 13-year-old curiosity about adult motivations, "do you ever miss the simple life you had before Papa asked you to care for Nicholas?" Rose considered the question thoughtfully, remembering the quiet satisfaction of teaching village children while living in modest contentment that had asked little of the world beyond basic security and meaningful work. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," she replied honestly, "but I could never regret the path that brought us to this family and this work. Catherine, when I agreed to care for Nicholas, I had no idea that kindness could lead to such extraordinary opportunities to help others." "And what about you, Papa?" Catherine continued. "Do you regret asking for help that changed your life so completely?" Duke Sebastian looked around the sitting room that held evidence of their family's expansion and success. Portraits of all three children, correspondence from officials throughout England seeking their advice, books on law and social policy that reflected their professional development, and felt profound satisfaction with choices that had seemed desperate at the time. "I regret only," he said with conviction that encompassed 15 years of shared adventures, "that it took crisis to teach me that the most important decisions are often the ones that seem impossible when you're making them." "Like agreeing to marry someone you barely knew to protect a child you'd just met?" Rose asked with gentle teasing that acknowledged the extraordinary nature of their beginning. "Like recognizing that love sometimes arrives disguised as duty," Sebastian replied, taking her hand with the same protective strength he had shown during their first conversation about Nicholas's needs, "and that the best families are often the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into." As evening approached and the London streets filled with the sounds of carriages returning from daily business, all three family members understood that their real adventure was far from over. The Royal Commission would provide new opportunities to expand their influence while protecting even more children from the abuses that Nicholas had survived. Their work had proven that individual courage could create institutional change, that village wisdom could inform national policy, and that families forged in crisis could become stronger than those that never faced challenges requiring genuine sacrifice for others' welfare. Nicholas would graduate from university and establish himself as one of England's most effective advocates for children's legal rights. Catherine would follow her own path into medicine, specializing in pediatric care that combined her mother's emotional intelligence with her father's systematic approach to solving complex problems. But for now, they were content to sit together in their London home, surrounded by evidence of lives well lived and love well expressed, secure in the knowledge that their family's story was still being written through the countless children whose lives had been touched by their willingness to extend protection when protection was desperately needed. Sometimes, they had learned, the most extraordinary adventures began with someone being brave enough to ask for help, and someone else being generous enough to provide it without question or reservation about where such assistance might lead. The village girl who had agreed to care for a duke's nephew had discovered that kindness could indeed change the world, one rescued child at a time. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story.